$25.
One thing to start with here,
Don't let that get away
if
from you.
you have any desire to do a seminar on your collection or your collecting experiences, see me after this is over or during the show. Now, these spots fill up fast, so don't wait. If you want to do one, let me know. Nobody bought that, did they? Anyway.
I like doing it.
Anyway, we're very fortunate. We got Charles Kaplan. Charles is the head of the MO and head of the webmaster and everything, and he's very knowledgeable on anything ship collecting. His favorite area is the Caribbean, and his seminar is Bahamian Rhapsody. And so, Charles, thank you very much for coming. And
Thank you, Jeff.
appreciate it.
Welcome. I always really enjoy being here. I like public speaking, and I also teach as a side job. And those lectures that I have to put together, it's mostly prepared material for me. I feel uncomfortable presenting it, but here I get to do exactly what I want to do, and I know the words, and doing it in front of people that I've known for years, and sharing some knowledge and stories, because I'm sure you're going to all add, because you know more than I do about certain things. So it's always a fun thing for me to do. So today's lecture is on the history of casinos in the Bahamas. And let's go look at what we're going to talk about. So the agenda is, we're going to talk a little bit about the Bahamas, and then we're going to talk about how casinos started in the Bahamas. They were legal, and certain individuals had some influence, maybe purchased influence, and got exemptions so they could open up casinos. And those were the early days, and then the mob came in and really started the casino industry, and then eventually casinos became legal and allowed for the development of the modern casinos that have there. And then we'll talk about some of the current casinos. So about the Bahamas, it's a chain of, over 700 islands in the Atlantic Ocean, just off the coast of Florida. It's the closest country other than Mexico and Canada to the United States, closer than Cuba. And most of the islands are small and uninhabited. It was a British colony, and they got their independence in 1973. So its closeness to the United States and its warm climate made it a very popular winter destination, winter vacation destination for people from the United States. And not only that, because of its closeness to the United States, it's always been used and is still used as a launching point to bring contraband into the United States. So that meant things that people couldn't get here, like during the Prohibition, alcohol, and now it's mostly drugs that come through the Bahamas into the United States. So here's a map of the Bahamas. You can see up in the left corner, that's Florida. Here's Cuba, and these are all the Bahamian islands. And then it ends with the Turk and Caicos Islands. So there are only a few places that have casinos. The main island is called New Providence Island, and the main town is Nassau. Up here, the closest point to the United States is Grand Bahama Island, and that's where Freeport is, and that's where the mob started casinos in the United States. There's a little island by Bimini called Cat Cay, and that's an interesting story we'll talk about. And there was one other island that had a casino for a short time, Wade Exuma, had Emerald Bay, and opened and closed within 2 years. Even though it's a modern casino, it was maybe within the last 10 years, no collectors went there. Those are the most impossible Bahamian ships to get. So here's a picture, here's a map of Nassau, in Providence Island. When you fly into the International Airport, get on the highway, and you either stop off at Cable Beach that has casinos, or you go downtown, this area, and here's Paradise Island, just off the coast of Nassau. And we'll be talking a lot about Paradise Island as well. So, casino law in the Bahamas.
Jump ahead of the slide.
So in 1901, they made casinos illegal. But, again, people were able to buy influence with the government and get exemptions to this law so they could operate casinos. And that happened for a couple of casinos. And then in 1969, they made casinos legal, and that's when the modern era started. In 2008, they made lotteries legal, and most recently in 2014, they made online gambling and what they call web shops, which is a place you could go to and use their computer in order to do online gaming. So again, casinos are legal in 1901, but people figured out a way around that restriction in order to open up casinos. And then eventually casinos became legal in 1969. And these are all the casinos. There are not that many of them. So there were 2 early casinos that opened with exemptions. And we'll talk about all these casinos in more detail. But here's just a timeline. And then the mob came in 1960, and they opened up a bunch of casinos. And then with the licensed casinos, the first one I believe was Playboy Club, 78, and then the rest of the casinos. So again, not that many casinos on the islands. So let's start with casino exemptions. There were 2 casinos operating illegally prior to exemptions being issued. One was Cat K Club, and we'll talk about these in more detail, and the other was the Bahamian Club in Nassau. These were not full-time casinos. Back in those days, this was a resort destination during the winter. So they opened about 3 months a year, and they were for members only. So let's look at these places. The first is Cat K Club, and it's an interesting place. In 1931, the Lassies purchased the island for $400,000, which doesn't seem like much now, but back then, that was millions and millions of dollars. And they developed the island into a resort, a private club for 200 members. And when we say club, these people had residences there. It wasn't like a hotel. When you got a hotel room, you became a member of the place and you got a place to live there. At the time, the Duke of Windsor was appointed the governor of the Bahamas, and he had a place there. And he mentioned it might be nice to have a little casino gambling here. So that is how the first exemption was issued. Since he was the governor, he makes the law. And he gave himself an exemption, or he gave the Wassies an exemption, so that they could run a casino legally in Cat K, although it was known that they had casino nights long before this. Wassie died in 1969. The exemption expired with his death, but his daughter got it renewed. And then in 1965, a hurricane destroyed the casino, and that was the end of it. So here's the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. You might know this guy because he's the famous King of England who abdicated in order to marry a non-royal, Wallis Simpson. And here's the only known chip from Cat K Island, extremely rare, and I've never actually seen one. So that's how rare they are.
Charles, is that scan courtesy of the chip guy?
Yes. Oh, I forgot to mention, the second slide here had a disclaimer.
Okay.
That many of these images are courtesy of the chip guy. Oh, and I should have pointed out this token. What you're looking at is, I'm not sure if these were used as currency on the island or within the casino. We don't know, but it's a cat sitting on a key for Cat K. And that's the symbol of the island.
Is that a quay chip?
Yes,
I can't see it.
It's
Have
a-
a rim design?
it's a T-mold.
A keyhole?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't remember where we got the image from, but we didn't get a very high-res image, and that's the sharpest I could make it, blowing it up to that size.
Is the token gold or brass? Or bronze? The token.
It's kind of a light brown color.
Tokens.
The token,
Yeah.
they're known in brass and silver. And that's a half a key, there's a full key, and there might be some other.
And don't they pronounce C-A-Y key in Bahamas? So cat key, that makes sense, right? Maybe, I don't know.
Could be,
Could be mine.
could be. That's Jamaica. And then there was the Bahamian Club in Nassau. This was a gentlemen's only club. It opened in 1920, and its members, it was a private member club, were a lot of what they called the Bay Street Boys. In the Bahamas, was ruled by a small group that were appointed by England. The Queen of England, England had dominion over the Bahamas. They appointed the governor, and they ran the islands. So there was a small group that made up the government, and it was kind of what we call an oligarchy today. They ran it for their own benefit. They made laws that allowed them to participate unfairly in the economy. And these are some of the Bay Street Boys over here. And in the old days, those were the chips that we used at the Bahamian Club. So it operated as an illegal casino with government members, because who was going to say anything about it? The people who make the laws are there, the people who are gambling there. So they operated since the 20s, and in 1939, when they got the exemption for Cat K, they also got themselves an exemption for the Bahamian Club. And those are some of the chips that they used there. They had both U.S. denomination as well as English denomination chips. And they are rare as well. You hardly ever see these come up for sale. In 1965, the Bahamian Club became the new Bahamian Club with a new owner. And we'll talk about that when we get to the mob era. So, how do you find out about mob era stuff? They don't publish annual reports. But it's amazing what a wealth of knowledge is out there. Those are some of the books that I consulted to get the information. So, I don't know how they got the information, but the amazing details on how the mob operated, not just in the Bahamas, but elsewhere in the Caribbean. And that's where I got my information from. So let's talk about the mob era. What kicked off the mob moving into the Caribbean was the Cuban Revolution. The mob openly operated in Cuba and ran all the big casinos and hotels there. And then in 1959, with the revolution, they were out of business, with the mob running casinos and these glitzy hotels as the pinnacle of corruption of the Cuban government. So they were the first to go. And on the day of the revolution, they went into several of the casinos and smashed them up. But that was the end of the casino industry, although some of the casinos stayed open for a few years after that. They weren't closed by the government, but they didn't have any customers. So here's a list of some of the casinos. The Riviera, which was in its day the nicest, most expensive hotel built in the Caribbean. And that was Mayor Lansky's deal. And on the night of the revolution, they asked him, "What do you think about what's going on?" And he said, "Well, I guess I crapped out." So they were able to operate only because they had government cooperation. And last year when I did my Cuban thing, I put the part of Godfather 2 when they're on the roof celebrating Lansky's birthday. And he says, "We've never done so well with the wonderful cooperation we have with the government who knows how to treat business people." And that's what they were talking about. So the industry shut down, and now they had all this talent and equipment, and they needed something else to do with it, and they spread out to all corners of the Caribbean, including the Bahamas. So a little bit about what happened in the Bahamas to entice the mob to come there. In 1955, they passed the Hawksbill Creek Act. And what that did is it allowed Wallace Groves, and we'll talk about who he is, but it allowed this guy to purchase 211 square miles of undeveloped land on Grand Bahama Island. And they pretty much made him king over that dominion, where he was exempt from the regular laws, the Bahamian laws, and he could pretty much make up his own rules. So he set up the Grand Bahama Development Company to develop land. The Bahamas Port Authority developed a port, which became Freeport, and Bahamas Amusements Limited to operate the casinos. So who was this guy, Wallace Groves? He was a prominent investor in the United States, didn't always follow the rules, wound up in federal jail, and then when he was released in 1944, he moved to the Bahamas and decided to set up shop there. So he teamed up with Sir Stafford Sands, who was the Minister of Finance in the Bahamas, held other important positions of influence in the government, and he was the inside guy. So Groves was the guy making the deals, getting cooperation with the government through Stafford Sands. And that's how the influence came in. And by the way, Groves was known to be an associate of Lansky. Who were some of the mob guys who were in the Caribbean? Of course, Lansky was the boss. Michael Blaney, you might know him. He had a casino with his name downtown Vegas, McLaney's. Dino Cellini, who was one of his big casino executives in Cuba, and then in London, and then he came back to run casinos in the Bahamas. His brothers were involved, and a bunch of other guys. But I just wanted to show you some of the mob guys so I could find some information about going through those records. And after the mob came to the Bahamas and opened up the casinos, they operated openly with government cooperation, and it didn't go unnoticed. And in February of 1967, the Saturday Evening Post and Life magazine both published exposés about mafia influence in the Bahamas. And that caused some problems for the mob, and a lot of those people who were on the previous chart were no longer welcome, because the United States threatened to put on sanctions on the Bahamas if they allowed these mobsters to operate. and take money from American citizens. So let's start off with the King's Inn. So when Wallace Groves was developing Freeport, one of the investors he got was Daniel Ludwig. Ludwig was a billionaire American shipbuilder, and he wanted to get into the hotel industry. So he started up the Princess Hotels with 2 hotels in Bermuda, the Southampton Princess and the Hamilton Princess, and he built 2 hotels on Grand Bahama Island, King's Inn, and Xanadu Beach Resort. And he also built the International Bazaar, where El Casino is. He was given a handshake deal that he'd be able to open up a casino next to the King's Inn. But something happened in between, maybe some influence peddling, and he was denied that opportunity. And instead, well, we'll see what happened instead. But the King's Inn was no longer viable to him without a casino, and it became the Bahamas Princess Hotel. So eventually, Lucayan Beach opened. While it was in design, and before they had an exemption, in the blueprints, they had a big room that was labeled handball courts. And then after they got the exemption, that became the casino. It didn't do very well. It opened January 1964 and closed 18 months later. Lansky was brought in for a hefty chunk of the profit of the place, and it became a success. And you can see some of the Lucayan Beach initial chips. That's a matchbook cover and a very colorful roulette lighter that I'm sure Jerry Burrell has one of, at least. So the first was Lucayan Beach, and this was allowed to open in Freeport because Wallace Groves had dominion over that land. It was exempted from gaming law. It was like its own territory. They got an exemption because the law didn't apply to them. And then the Bahamian Club became the new Bahamian Club, new ownership, mob ownership. It was purchased by Mary Carter Paints. And we'll talk about what Mary Carter Paints is. I think that's the next slide. But here are some of the Bahamian Club chips, and they are exceedingly rare to find. And most of the ones that you find, you can see they're drilled. I guess we'll find out when the casino closed. I guess they use those as keychains. So, in 1967, El Casino opened. That was the casino that Daniel Ludwig was supposed to get, but it became a mob casino. It was opened by Cellini, and in 1978, it was sold to Resorts International. That's the same Resorts International that has resorts in Atlantic City. Okay? And then later it closed, became the Princess Casino, the Bahamian Casino, and then the Royal Oasis. And today, there is no open casino there. So let's get to the last mob casino, which is Paradise Island. And Paradise Island has a very interesting story to it. It starts off with another billionaire, Huntington Hartford, who was the heir to the A&T fortune. And he might have not been the brightest businessman, but he saw an opportunity to buy Paradise Island and Zenfo Hog Island, which was undeveloped, and it got its name because I believe pigs dropped off there from ships and inhabited the island. They were the only inhabitants, so they called it Hog Island. So he spent a lot of his own money, $30 million, developing a resort there. And it was not doing well for a couple of reasons. One reason was, in order to get there, you had to take a ferry there. You couldn't just drive onto the island. So it was an inconvenience to get there, and once you got there, there was no casino. So Huntington tried to open up a casino, grease the palms to get an exemption for himself, but he didn't pick Sir Safford Sand to be his inside guy, his lawyer, and he wasn't successful. So he now had a failing business, and in 1964, he sold it to the Mary Carter Paint Company. There's Mary Carter Paint again. So who is Mary Carter Paint Company? It was the Benjamin Moore of the day in the 1950s. It was sold to investors in 1958 with James Crosby as the CEO. He wanted to diversify into other businesses, including real estate development. And Mary Carter Paint was an early customer of Wallace Groves. They built residential neighborhoods on Grand Bahama Island in that exempted land area. I guess things happened, conversations were held, and they decided to get into the casino business and purchased the Bahamian Club in 1963. Eventually, they changed the name, got out of the paint business, and changed the name to Resorts International. That happened in 1968. They opened up the first casino in Atlantic City, Resorts International. In the same year, they also purchased El Casino. So now they had 3 casinos, El Casino, the Bahamian Club, and Resorts International. And they began the construction of the Taj Mahal Casino in Atlantic City. And that was in 1983. 1986, James Crosby suddenly dies, and the company is up for grabs. And who's after the company? Merv Griffin and Donald Trump. Multiple lawsuits back and forth. Gee, you didn't see that coming, did you? Multiple lawsuits back and forth over several years, and finally a settlement was made, and Trump gets the Taj Mahal, and Merv Griffin got Paradise Island and Resorts International. So you will see Merv Griffin casino stuff with both of those places mentioned on them. So we're accumulating a number of billionaires. The story keeps running into billionaires who got into the casino business here. So Paradise Island opens, and even though Mary Carter Paint Company, now Resorts International, owns the resort, it's the mob who is running the casinos. They ran the casino here, they ran the El Casino, and the other resorts, except maybe Atlantic City. And those are a bunch of Paradise Island chips, and that's a $5 Merv Griffin Paradise Island chip from when he had ownership. Now, one thing I wanted to show you is these are the mob era $1 chips from the Bahamas. Look how similar they all are to each other. The first 3 are small keys, but the last one's a large key. They're all beige. They all have 3 sets of inserts. The first 3 are all red, purple, the purple in the other one. The name of the casino is at the top of the white inlay. The location is at the bottom of the inlay, and there's a large dollar in the middle. Kind of tells me there's no doubt that the same guy was making all these chips. And here's another billionaire we ran into in the Bahamas. You remember that Howard Hughes stayed at the Desert Inn, and they wanted the high roller suite back for high rollers, and he refused and instead bought the Desert Inn and went on to buy a bunch of other casinos in town. And then eventually on Thanksgiving Eve 1970, he was taken to Nellis Air Force Base and flown out to the Bahamas, where he stayed on the top floor of the Britannia Beach Hotel, which is adjoining to Paradise Island, to the Paradise Island Resort and Casino. And notice it's a Resorts International property that he was staying at. He eventually moved out of there and to Xanadu Beach Resort, which was another Resorts International property. So there seems to be some connection, although we don't have any evidence that he was really involved in the casino business. But he was involved with people who were in the casino business. And then he eventually moved out of Xanadu Beach just 2 months before he passed away. So let's look at some of the casinos, the legal era casinos that are no longer around. And the first is the Playboy Club. It was the first casino, legal casino to open up that didn't need an exemption, just a license. It was at the Atascadero Beach Hotel on Cable Beach. And they had money, croupiers dealing in the casino. That's a lot of neat memorabilia from that time. And there are a set of the Playboy casino chips. But Playboy Club got in trouble, first in London because of mobster involvement, and England closed down the Playboy Club. And then Playboy was denied a permanent license for the Playboy Club in Atlantic City, and they had to sell out to, what did it become? I forget what it became in Atlantic City, but they were no longer Atlantic City, and then they were no longer welcome in the Bahamas because of the mob involvement. So Playboy Club had a good start there, but it didn't last very long, only about 5 years in operation. When Playboy closed, they sold their license to Carnival Cruises, and Carnival moved the casino to Cable Beach, to the Malia Cable Beach Hotel. The casino was operated by Carnival Cruises, and if you look at the chips, you can see at the top, here's the Carnival logo imprinted on the chips. And then in 1988, it got renamed to the Crystal Palace, when Carnival also purchased the hotel. So here's the Crystal Palace. It was a big casino, the biggest casino on the island for a while, and it was shared by two big hotels, the Wyndham and Sheraton. And they had a nice set of Bud Jones chips that they used in the casino. Next casino that opened was the replacement for the El Casino, which is the Princess Casino. It operated for a long time, 17 years, and then eventually became the Bahamian Hotel. And they have an interesting set of chips. And it was, believe it or not, it was much easier to find information about mob era casinos, which are supposed to be secret, than the current casinos. So here was a set of chips from the Bahamian, and it only operated a short time. It became the Royal Oasis, and as a Royal Oasis, it didn't do well, and was in operation a couple of years, and was destroyed by Hurricane Francis, and there was no casino there. in the International Bazaar anymore. You can see whose name is on this card. Anybody know that guy?
Yep.
So, El Casino, Lucline Beach became Treasure Bay. Lucline Beach became Isle of Capri. It's the same Isle of Capri company that owned the riverboat casinos in the south. So, the logo and the chips look very similar to, if you're a riverboat collector, the chips that they use at their other casinos. And that operated a few years and became Treasure Bay. And like the previous casino, it was destroyed by a hurricane in 2020, Hurricane Edward, and it is no longer open. There's no casinos. So there are no casinos on the island of Grand Bahama Island anymore. If you want a casino, you have to go to either today Paradise Island, Cable Beach, or Bimini Island. That's a casino. We'll talk about the currently open casinos. And this is the casino I referred to before, Emerald Bay. It opened on Great Exuma Island, which is really just a resort, small resort island, not enough business. It was only open less than 2 years, and it closed. And I don't have any of these chips. They're just not available. I think there was one collector, John Rinaldi, who was able to get some of these chips, and that's how we have images of them. So that's a modern day rarity. Just, opened a little over 10 years ago, and nobody has the chips, and they've never come out. So these are the open casinos. The Atlantis Casino on Paradise Island. The history was it was sold to Saul Kersner, Sun International Casinos from South Africa, and renamed the Atlantis. And he made it into a mega resort. I've been there several times. They have an aquarium that to me feels like if Disney made an aquarium, this is what it would look like. Extremely high quality and well run.
Walk underneath.
Yeah, you can walk to it.
I think over here, this is part of it. There's a slide from the pyramid that goes through a shark tank. So you're on a water slide that goes through a shark tank.
They have that at the Nugget downtown.
And I have this picture up here. These are two of the towers of the resort, and they're joined to each other by what looks like a bridge, but it's actually a rentable room. It goes up for something like $25,000 a night, and people don't really stay there, but they hold events there. And when we were there one time, my wife's a travel agent. I talked to some people there, and we got a tour of the bridge room. That's what they call it, the bridge room. And it's people like Oprah Winfrey who will have a evening party and they'll rent it out for the night. Really doesn't do justice looking at it like this, but it's, when you're standing in the room, it's like windows as high as, the floor that you're looking at, so it looks like you're just standing in the middle of no place, just out in the open. It's really spectacular. And last time I was there, Ricky Lake was playing at the blackjack table. You remember who she was. So, it's one of the two really grand resorts in the Bahamas, Atlantis, and the other one is relatively new. Well, we'll get to it next. But there's another small casino, And this casino exists because they run junkets or ferries from Florida to Resort World Bimini. Albert, I think you were on that boat?
Not on that one.
Not on that?
I do the boat from West Palm to Freeport.
Okay. But they do the same thing for here, and that's how they get most of their business. So it's a relatively small casino, and also very few people have been there, so very few of these ships around are hard to find.
Charles, that boat will run out of either Fort Lauderdale or Miami,
Okay.
the junket that runs out of there.
And then there is the newest resort, which is the Bahamas in Cable Beach. And it is a giant resort. There's something like 3 hotels, 3 hotels, 2,200 rooms, private residence on there. And when we talked about the Crystal Casino, it was not doing well while this was being built. They bought that property and turned the casino into a residence for the workers they brought in from overseas to build this place. So, but you've been here?
No,
Oh, no, that's right. So, but there is no casino now in Freeport.
no.
No. So that boat doesn't, the casino boat doesn't operate anymore?
The boat operates just to take you to Freeport and then do an extension, a 2-night or 4-night at one of the resorts. But the new ship, Margaritaville, has its own casino on it.
So it's only casino, it's only gambling on the way to and from?
Yes,
Okay. So it used to be, the gambling on the boat was something to keep you busy to get to the real casino in Freeport.
yes,
Now it's the only gambling.
that was the only one.
And I guess you could go to Freeport if you want to buy things duty-free. That's why it's called Freeport. Okay. So that is the history of the casinos and the few casinos that were there. Along the way, we talked about a bunch of these billionaires that were involved in the casino business. The Duke of Windsor, Daniel Ludwig, shipbuilder, Huntington Hartford from A&P, Howard Hughes, Merv Griffin, Donald Trump. We don't know if Lansky was a billionaire. They said he was worth $300 million when he died, although they never found it. But I put him in the billionaire class. And Saul Kersner from Sun International also is extremely wealthy. And the guy who owned the Genton Casino, Lukine Beach, became Lukine Beach Genton, and Resort World, he's also a billionaire. But then there is one really exclusive neighborhood, as well as some billionaires own the islands. So Lyford Cay is an exclusive neighborhood on New Providence Island, before you get to Cable Beach. And there are a bunch of billionaires who have homes there. Oprah Winfrey has a place on Paradise Island. And there are a couple of guys, John Malone and Ed Passage, who own little islands and have residences there. So, a lot of billionaires in the Bahamas. So where did I get the information from? There was a report produced, a commission of inquiry into the operation of business of casinos in Freeport and Nassau. And it has amazing details, and I think that was what was used by the 2 magazines, Saturday Evening Post and Life in 1967, to get all their information from the magazine. And then there were a lot of places online that I was able to find information. This website is particularly good for providing information. But about the old casinos, I tried my best. I find a lot of information about the operation of the current casinos. Who are the owners? You know, why did they close? What was the issues? That information is just not, couldn't find it. questions about the information or anything you want to share with the group?
Hey, Charles, just kind of this, it's not verified, but the Bahamian people were not allowed to go to those casinos or play there when they opened the Bahamas. We went there and the people were very resentful, but since then I've heard that all the Bahamian people cannot go there. It's against the law for them to go in casinos, all the casinos. Is that true?
Well, and again, you know, we talked about the two places that had got exemptions early. You know, those were people who lived there. You know, the Bay Street boys were Bahamian residents, so they were let in there.
This is more
They were the
more
ruling class.
yeah.
The regular people couldn't go. They couldn't be a member of the Bahamian club and they couldn't get in there. So I think maybe when they made licensed casinos, the licensed casinos were tourists only.
The people that I talked to said they said that they were very resentful of the fact that they couldn't gamble. They're just the laws would not let them participate.
And that's not unusual.
Yeah.
I know when I was in that only tourists can gamble in the casinos in Aruba.
Ludwig, in 1961, I used to live in Mexico City. I had my morning coffee at the Kennebec restaurant, both Rosa, Mexico City. Ludwig was there every morning. Nobody knew who he was until about, I think, 64. They published a portrait in a Mexican magazine. Of course, he was there. He wanted to build a hotel in Mexico City. They wouldn't give him a permit, so he went to Acapulco and ended up building the Princess Hotel, which, by the way, when Hughes died, don't tell anyone, because they didn't want to get involved with a Mexican thing, so they claimed he died in the Bahamas. Anyhow,
Okay.
can't confirm. I was working for a newspaper at the time, and one of the reporters went down to the Princess Hotel, Acapulco, to track down Howard Hughes dismissed. Anyhow, Ludwig, they say nobody knew who he was, drinking on the road, cab by himself.
Okay. Did you ever meet him? Or you just saw him?
I just saw him. They say he was. I was there every day. He was there every morning. Yeah.
Okay. Sometimes they're approachable.
No, I had no idea where he was, so I saw
Okay.
his portrait in the magazine.
All right, so you just saw this guy every day and then you sort of
Yeah,
picture
that
it
was
later.
Ludwig.
He's before my time. You know, I don't remember him.
Oh, he came under Wisconsin.
Was one of the Cellini brothers, Edward?
Yeah.
I talked with him years ago, you know. Him and Slim Ewing were building a casino somewhere in Central America. And they ordered chips, and we made the chips. And I asked Slim, you know, in his rinky-dink country, what are you doing down there? And what he told me was money laundering. But they never did open the casino because the government figured out what was going on. So I ended up with the chips. And then Slim one day called me up and said, send me the chips. And then a couple of years later, Ed called up and said, where are those chips? And I said, well, I sent them to Slim. So I don't know whatever happened to them, but...
Have you ever seen him?
no, I haven't seen him, no. I don't know what happened to him. But, that was my run-in. I didn't know who Ed was at the time. I had no idea. I just found out a couple of years ago when I read he was like the head of the mob in Florida or something, you know. I said, oh, that's the guy.
You never know who your customers are.
Yeah.
As long as they pay you.
I was gonna say, if you go a man or if you get paid.
Small world.
That's right.
If you don't get paid, you're not gonna find a
I
collection
got paid.
agency that's gonna.
They were good about that.
All right, that's what I do.
At 3 o'clock, we've got Oscar Kaplan. He's giving a seminar on just chips discoveries and stuff like that. So come back at 3. Charles, very good. Thank you very much.